This is going to be a sort of a panel session. We'll have 10 minutes to talk each, and then we'll open the discussion. Our title is Extending the Economist Toolkit, but it will be interdisciplinary. We'll hear from Lise Sasaki, an experienced anthropologist and a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney. And then we will hear from Mark Diesendorf, Associate Professor in Environment and Society at the University of New South Wales, and actually also a trained theoretical physicist, and now an ecological economist with an immense research impact. And I think he's going to bring all of these issues together for us that we've spoken about today. Well, what I think about these issues is that they're symptoms. The cause is our economics curriculum. It's dominated by something called neoclassical economics, which is a very narrow perspective that uses models from physics. So these folks, they oversimplify reality for the sake of these mathematical models, and their curriculum impacts the way a whole generation thinks. In fact, Paul Samuelson said, "I don't care who writes a nation's laws if I can write their economics textbooks. But some stuff can't be mathematized, so it leaves a lot of stuff out that is important to you and me. It treats people as calculators, markets as fair and balanced, and it oversimplifies unemployment and inequality. And corporations loves it when this happens. And then they donate, and they lobby, and then government loves it too. So we should get back to what economics was like before all of this happened. It used to be called political economy. There's a wonderful book, From Economics to Political Economy, by Tim Thornton. And it explains how things used to be more interdisciplinary. For example, in anthropology, we see an individual with complex needs and complex behaviors in a culture, in a world. But those economic models, they think in terms of physics. And even new physics, like quantum physics, complexity science, chaos theory, I think that actually makes it worse. Because from our surveys, we can see students feel tricked. They think they'll study how the world works, but they really just study a few lines on a graph. So if we can teach economics properly, it will do a lot of good. And from our curriculum reviews, we have an idea of what economics can become. It includes all of these interactions, mental processes, habits and thoughts, everything in the natural world and our institutions. They're little habits that we follow, and then they become ingrained in our society, and then they shape our behavior. And before you know it, it's a government institution or a financial institution. Neoclassical economics is like this. Think of astrology before Copernicus, where increasingly complicated and scientific models were used to explain that the whole universe rotates around the Earth. So proponents of this theory, they use impressive models with a lot of observational data, but the more correct Copernican model that explains the sun is the center of the universe could be explained without any of these complicated repairs to a troubled theory. And you see this with neoclassical production functions, utility functions, supply and demand. So they say we go to that equilibrium point where there's no real unemployment. Everyone has whatever they demand. Unemployment, inequality, that'll self-correct when the government leaves this system alone. So that's what neoclassical economics pulled out of their physics textbooks. It doesn't describe society. So when psychologists say, no, people don't think like calculators, then the neoclassical goes and categorizes these mistakes, and they tweak their models, and then you get more of that. So I think we expect better from economics than this. But neoclassical economics, they protect that formal way because they spend years studying this with calculus. But there's nothing underneath it all. It's just a smokescreen. Every economic disaster from today's from the financial crisis to today's wealth inequality happened because policymakers followed these neoclassical ideas of markets being our saviors, and they teach that this creates an optimal outcome because the maths don't lie. The greatest theories are not formal. A complex economic system cannot be captured formally. A neoclassical, complicated lie can, but that cannot explain reality well enough to guide policy or to understand economic issues. So from our surveys and our curriculum reviews and input from teachers, we've created a curriculum outline. So first, you teach what can and cannot be represented with numbers. So you teach a bit of philosophy first. There's a trade-off, you see. You can speak about something in complex detail, but the more formal you make that theory, you lose these details. Then you introduce that big picture. You start with the actual individual, but neoclassical economics talks about a representative agent. Prof. Diesendorf wrote a good paper on this. But we see the actual individual, genuine needs and preferences. Both this internal need and the external, the body, is both important. We heard that in some of the talks. It shapes every action and choice you make. Neoclassical economics, they talk about methodological individualism, where the economy is just the total of these representative agents. But we see complex connections between these individuals and between tangible and intangible elements. Going back to Robert's talk. So for example, it's like this. At the top, we've got the physical environment. In fulfilling these needs and goals that we have, we use that physical environment to make stuff and build stuff. And it's all connected. Not only do we change the environment, for better or worse, it changes us, both internally and externally. And emerging from this human-environment interaction is this cultural world. And here we deal with things like how the self fits into the community. Is it a hierarchy? Is it a small lateral society? Is it patriarchy? Institutions, I mentioned those. Collective goals, well, these arise from government, cartels, any collective of people. An empire tries to dominate. A market society tries to compete. An intentional community might have a goal of managing common pool resources collectively. Okay. So it's all connected, right? One change, it bounces all around the system. Big agriculture, didn't that lead to a shift in social structure? Perhaps we went from hierarchies, from flat systems to hierarchies. Didn't that lead to changes in the individual, altering our needs and goals? When the collection of surplus gave rise to empires and further shifts in culture, and eventually the industrial age, right? Didn't that lead to nature being commodified, institutions overriding each other? So it bounces all around. So you can trace a complex evolving economy. You can compare two economies, for example, one in the global north and one in the global south. You can think of new developments, like instead of the agricultural revolution, think of the AI revolution, maybe expand the framework. So once you've got this big picture, learning about these different schools of economic thought, they become fun and easy. Neoclassical economics, they talk about needs for goods and services from markets. So this way, it can all be associated with numerical levels, like consumers maximize pleasure, producers maximize profit. But when you look at this picture, you see this is demand and supply in isolation. It oversimplifies the individual in the middle. Markets don't operate in isolation. Communities can manage their own resources, make their own rules, depending on the object at the top in question. Feminist economics, they highlight that patriarchy is dominant. And in the middle, it reminds us to consider all needs, like the need for care not provided by markets. Everything is part of an ecology. Behavior is based on the whole system. Complexity economics, they model the relationships between the individual and the environment, but they still need a clear picture to base everything on. And behind these results, we see certain structures. So instead of using one perspective or comparing the perspectives, you fit them into the framework. With this, that sees the economy emerging from a changing individual in a changing cultural and physical environment, neoclassical economics. It can be replaced by an interdisciplinary conceptual framework that is compatible with real-world complexities. What if you take this picture to the economics department? Students love it, economists not so much. They tell you, Dennis, you can't fit this into our models. Well, yes. Does that mean reality is wrong or your model is wrong? Oh, all models are wrong, Dennis. Yeah, but yours misrepresent theories from social science. So to guide them, you can put this into a conceptual model to kind of show how concepts interact. Remember I told you about the trade-off? You can talk about something, explore different scenarios, put it on paper, some stuff gets lost. But yeah, the conceptual model shows you how things interact. For example, how the individual chooses between objects in the environment and how the meaning of object is connected to culture. From there, you can then construct an empirical model. But the thing is, economists don't have that conceptual model to use as a reference and check back where the empirical models might be leaving things out or doing stuff wrong. But we have the opportunity to show them. If you've got a culture connected to goods, connected to the internal environment of a unique individual, you start to see this complex system. You can understand economies better. So now our next speaker is going to be Lise Sasaki. Thank you so much, everyone. Give her a hand.
Hello, my name is Lise Sasaki. I'm an anthropologist, so it's a little bit of a different, I get quite nervous because I feel like it's a room full of economists and I'm from a completely different discipline. I thought it'll be fun for us to kind of talk about cultural aspects of sharing and gifting for my field site in Japan. And I'm going to be talking about osusawake, which is a gift, obligation, and embodied exchange in rural Japan. Hopefully in the next 10 minutes we can kind of go and travel to Japan a little bit, it'll be quite fun, and also tap into the aspects of different cultures and how they explore a different type of social and cultural economy. So, my field site is in Japan, in an island called Shikoku Island, which is the smallest island in the country, and my field site is in Tosacho, which is that red bit of the island. It's in Kochi Prefecture, and Tosacho has about 3,000 people, but they are dispersed in different mountains. One village would consist of about 10 families, and to get from one village to the next, it takes about an hour drive. So it's a very dispersed town, village area. Tosacho is quite hard to get to because it's smack in the middle of Shikoku Island. So it's quite isolated from everything else, but it's got the most beautiful river in the country, most beautiful mountains, and it has kind of preserved a lot of traditional cultural ways of living in the country, in Japan. So, when I returned home one afternoon in Tosacho, a small village in the mountains of Kochi Prefecture, there was a basket of cucumbers and karu, a type of radish, at my doorstep. No note, no message, just a quiet trace of someone's care. I recognized the basket as the way the vegetables were arranged. It was too much for one person to eat, and that excess told me something. This was not just food. It was a gesture of inclusion. It said, "You belong here." This is osusawake, the everyday practice of sharing surplus food, seedlings, or seasonal goods with neighbors. It isn't charity nor simple kindness. Everyone knows they will one day be a giver or a receiver of such gifts. For an anthropologist, this moment captures something fundamental, that economic life is not abstract or transactional, but relational and embodied. Ososawake, literally sharing portion, is an enactment of belonging. It is, what I want to argue today, a moral and affective economy through which the rhythms of social life are sustained and felt. So when I got the cucumbers, I pickled them. This is a type of pickling you do in Japan. And then also, this is a type of fern that you can have, and it takes quite a lot of, it's quite a lot of labor to get the tips of it. And I saw that also left on my doorstep as well. I don't know when they left it, but I know who did because of who grows the cucumbers, who grows these ferns. So this is the kind of reciprocation that we have in the village. Anthropology reminds us that economies are rarely governed by calculation alone. They are interwoven with affection, obligation, and subtle social feeling. Marcel Mauss, in The Gift, described giving as a total social fact, joining the material, moral, and spiritual. To give is to create a bond. To receive is to accept another's personhood. To reciprocate is to reaffirm one's place in the world. In Ososawake, the principles persists. Giving maintains the moral structure of community. Yet, as Pierre Bourdieu reminds us, such exchanges are sustained not only by rules, but by habitus, a deeply embodied sense of what is proper and graceful. In Japan, this habitus is colored by emotions, gratitude, indebtedness, shame, and warmth, the moral texture of everyday life. So to understand these feelings, it helps to listen to Japanese thinkers who have written from within their own cultural worlds. Doikakeyo's The Anatomy of Dependence introduced amae, which means dependence, the desire to rely on another's benevolence. He saw amae as a universal emotion that Japanese society has institutionalized, allowing people to seek closeness without shame. In Ososawake, amae is palpable. To give is to invite dependence. To receive is to affirm it. A basket at the door is both generosity and an invitation to belong to that community. Shienakane, in Japanese society, described Japan's web of vertical relations, not rigid hierarchies, but networks of interdependence. In Tosacho, these frames of belonging are visible in every gesture. Older women who oversee the rhythms of seasonal exchange, newcomers who give back quickly to avoid appearing ungrateful, the younger mothers learning these moral cues to integrate into village life. Finally, Jungian psychologist Kawai Hayao offers a poetic note. For him, haji, or shame, is not punishment, but a recognition of interconnectedness, a reminder that we are always seen by others. In the rural Mora economy, this sense of being seen shapes how people give, when they give, and what they give. Haji, this shame, in this sense, becomes an emotional infrastructure of community. In Kosacho, Ososawake is everywhere. In cucumbers, rice, homemade pickles, and even gossip. An elderly woman might appear at a neighbor's door with a small bag of dried persimmons. The recipient bows, protesting lightly, "I can't possibly," even as she accepts. Laughter follows, then the ritual phrase, "Ososawake desu," it's just a little sharing. What looks effortless is finely choreographed. Everyone knows who gives more, who reciprocates late. Yet these are rarely called debts. They are gestures of care, maintenance, and sometimes subtle competition. One participant told me, "You can't refuse a gift here. It's like refusing the person." That captures Moss's insight. The gift carries the giver's self. But it also echoes Doi's amae, the dependence, affection entangled with pressure, tenderness, and obligation. These dynamics extend beyond food to farming, childcare, and festivals. Even giving someone a lift to the supermarket 40 minutes away carries moral weight. One woman admitted, "Honestly, it tires me out." but it's how we live together. Obligation can feel heavy, but it's also what keeps the community coherent, what kawaii might call the moral burden of being seen. When I left the field, I assumed these small acts of exchange might end, but it didn't. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I was in Kyoto and unable to return to Kochi. Together with colleagues and the town's social welfare council, the Tosacho Social Welfare Council, we created a digital project using a message app, Line, Japan's equivalent of WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger. We formed 2 small groups of elderly women and welfare workers to keep in touch during isolation. Soon, one participant called to tell me about her harvests. A few days later, a parcel arrived. So from Kochi to Kyoto, it's about 4 hours by the bullet train, so it's very far. By flight, it's about an hour. So, a few days later, a parcel arrived. Bundles of bamboo shoots and shiitake mushrooms, neatly dried and salted. Inside was a note, which I'm holding here. Hearing your voice gave me strength. I'm sorry the box is secondhand. This too was ososowake, now crossing physical distance. Through messages, photos, and parcels, care traveled across screens and postal groups. Technology became a vessel for amae, for dependence, the desire to depend and to be dependent upon. Even online, giving remained embodied, carried through tone, emojis, and timing. The ethics of being seen persisted, creating new forms of obligation and intimacy. Ososowake had become a translocal economy of feeling, blending human warmth and digital mediation. So what does this tell us about economy? It reminds us that economic life is not a neutral system, but a moral landscape, sustained by emotion, gesture, and memory. The gift in Tosacho reveals that the economy is always social. In Japan, it is also profoundly emotional, shaped by amae, structured by belonging, and guarded by shame, by haji. Dependence, gratitude, and shame are not failures of individuality, but modes of interdependence. These emotions form an internalized, often unconscious disposition, a kind of psychic infrastructure through which care circulates. Seen this way, ososowake challenges the classical idea that individuals act alone in pursuit of self-interest. In Tosacho, life unfolds through ties with others. What matters is not merely what is exchanged, but the relationships and feelings that grow from it. The economy here is lived through the body, in gestures, timing, and touch. In Tosacho, the economy happens between people. In vegetables left at the doorstep, in the bowl of rice, in the quiet shame of not reciprocating soon enough. These gestures may seem small, yet they remind us that the economy is not merely a system of transactions, but a fabric of relationships sustained by care. To rethink economics, perhaps we need to start with attention to the gift, to relation, to the embodied ways people sustain one another. Malls call the gift a total social fact. In rural Japan, it remains exactly that. Total, relational, embodied. Economic life is not only about exchange, it is about the feeling of being bound to others, of being seen, needed, and sometimes quietly burdened by care. If economists seeks equilibrium, anthropologists find tenderness. And in that tenderness, we glimpse another economy altogether, one of giving, receiving, and the endless work of living together.
All right, to bring this all together for us, we've got Mark now. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dennis and Lisa. I think Lisa's presentation is really important because it opens up our minds to the fact that contradicts what we've been told. We've been told all along there's only one way of doing economics. There is a single economic system, it's capitalism, its extreme form is neoliberalism, and it's supposed to be justified supposed to be justified by the theory of neoclassical economics. And Lise has shown that osu sowake, I hope I've got that right, is another way of looking at it. That the economy is part of society. It depends on the kind of society that people want to live in, the cultures that support it. And I think if David Beaumont was still here, he would no doubt say something about Aboriginal society and how it too works without markets, but rather with a kind of social reciprocity, which, now it's a long time since I studied Anthropology 1, but I think anthropology has got an enormous amount to contribute to this whole problem of designing an economy that's fit for all human beings, for particular societies. And I think, certainly from what I learnt about Indigenous societies in Australia, they certainly weren't market societies. They worked extremely well, extremely complex set of relationships and reciprocities, and so we've got we can learn a lot from that. Now, my early doubts about the conventional economic system in industrial society started when I was a PhD student, and we were in a conference where we had a world-famous visiting theoretical physicist, Elliot Montroll, and he gave us a talk about what he thought was the new way that physics could be applied to economics and to society. And he gave us a case study with great pride, and he said, in the United States, our cities used to have, the main transport system was light rail, trams. However, due to the forces of statistical physics, that system was transformed to the motor car. Now, I was a very shy student and I kept my mouth shut then, but I wish I hadn't, because I was aware that the transformation in transportation that transformed the public transport, for example, in Los Angeles to car transport was not something that happened according to physical laws. It was the motor industry and related industries bought up the light rail and dismantled it.
Yeah.
That's how it happened. And that kind of thing cannot be built into simple physical models. Now, I certainly want to support what Dennis has said about the inadequacies of neoclassical economics trying to model itself on physics. Now, as Dennis mentioned, I was originally a theoretical physicist, and as a PhD student and beyond, I began to become interested in economics, and I was horrified that the so-called laws of economics were clearly not generally true. I mean, in physics, in school, you're taught Newton's laws of motion, and they are correct for all motion that isn't close to the speed of light. They are good models. They are simple model. It's a simple model, Newton's laws, but it works to a very high degree of accuracy. And it's only when speeds go close to the speed of light, or we're looking at the pathway of light close to a gravitational source, that we have to modify. And it becomes more complex, and we get Einstein's special theory and general theory of relativity. But the economic laws also, the so-called economic laws, in most cases, do not correspond to empirical observation. And this is one of the most amazing, outrageous things when you actually start looking critically at economics, that the attempts to make the theory agree with experiment are at very best half-hearted. They are, most of the models are what I would call Mickey Mouse models. Right? They are totally unrealistic in their initial assumptions. They do not agree with experiment or observation in most cases. Even the law of supply and demand, which is such a universal law, it does not hold all the time. It only holds sometimes. In some cases, the so-called supply curve and demand curve that Dennis showed you, in theory they have to cross, and the crossing point is the equilibrium point. In practice, with some industries and businesses, they never cross, and that's empirically true. Now, I'm clearly not going to use my slideshow very much. I'm just going to flash through a couple of slides just to see. So, this is Marx's take on conventional economics. The big circle is capitalism. The neoliberal ideology is in the middle, an extreme form, and the input on the side is the theory from neoclassical economics, which is almost entirely nonsense. Now, I've mentioned in my talk this morning several myths, but I just want to mention some other ones. The main fundamental myth, of course, is the whole conception of the economy as separate from the environment. So economics basically assumes that the environment is, and the economy is separate. I'm sorry this graph didn't come out very clearly. They're two separate things, if you can see in the top. And it was modified then when it was realised that environmental impacts had to be taken into account somehow. And so the environment, it still remains a source of resources for the economy, an external source and an external waste dump, basically, within that traditional framework. But a field called environmental economics, which is part of neoclassical economics, was invented, which said that if you get the prices right, you can protect the environment, which is certainly not generally true, although sometimes it helps. And so we have rather an alternative picture underneath where you try to get the environment protection, the environment which is our life support system. You build a society within that, ideally, and then you build an economy within that. I'm going to skip all this, skip all that. And I think I'm going to skip everything because I've talked long enough, and just say that the attempt to model economics on physics is a complete failure. To any physicist, or almost all physicists, except maybe Elliot Montrell, unless it's changed in his old age, it is a nonsense. And the complicated macroeconomic models all depend on very simple assumptions which are wrong. So, for example, general equilibrium models assume an equilibrium between supply and demand in the market. It doesn't in general happen. It is a mathematical simplification in order to create equations that can be solved. So we need a better economy. We need to think anthropologically. We need to think about human society and the kind of economy that is appropriate for our society. And that means asking the big questions. And I think Dex and I started discussing some big questions before these events started, which are, what kind of a society do we really want? What sort of industries or businesses do we want? Do we want a society, for example, that has trains in it? And if that's the case, then we have to think about, well, what are we going to build the trains out of, and how we organise society. But these questions are not being discussed within our society, very rarely discussed even in the independent magazines and websites. So we need to push this forward, and I hope we'll have a good discussion. So thank you.
Can I ask you a question as an anthropologist? Yes. One of the things that you talked about is this, a cultural thing of gift giving and how it's so important. Can you make a comment on how maybe in Western society gift giving has turned into consumerism?
In anthropology, what you want to look at is your everyday life and how much of social structure and cultural structures are interwoven in the mundane things that you do every day. And so if you think about it, the cards that you gift for your friends, or even just a little bit of dinner that you share with other people, that is a sort of gift economy. Anything that has a little bit of yourself that you're sharing with others, that counts as you being part of a community, reciprocating yourself to other people, and that social relation keeps going and going, but it's through an object, it's through a thing. But you have to make sure that you understand there's a part of you in it. And it's just that in Japan, it's done with so much more social obligation and a little bit of shame and guilt that's been built in there. So people are always kind of like on their feet to think, ooh, I've got to give back to that person that I didn't give back before. So there's a little bit of fear in it, which kind of makes that cohesive social environment and brings that community together, because it maintains that social order. And also kind of like a hierarchy. In East Asian countries, there's a lot of, you have to respect the elders. And so this gift economy that happens in Sasaki also maintains that social gender dynamics, the generational dynamics as well. So it's just in different cultural contexts that it's done in, and you can find that in your everyday life too. Does that answer your question?
I think then it was Bradley Schott, and then Dex, and then Tom Foster, and that will be the only questions we can take. We are a bit over time.
If we look at Homo economicus in terms of their personality and their character traits, Homo economicus is an asshole. And when we aggregate that in the micro foundations way into a greater economy and society, we end up with a society and an economic system that effectively rewards people for being assholes. And I'm wondering, I don't even know who this question is for really, I'm wondering why do you think economists will have designed a society that way?
Because they can solve the equations more easily that way. No, seriously. And look, Lise can correct me if I'm wrong, but from my earlier little bit of education in anthropology, it seems to be true that every human society has a basis in cooperation. And it's just that our industrial society has put much more emphasis on competition than cooperation. But if you look at other societies that anthropology has studied, cooperation is the prime basis, and competition has a much smaller role. But perhaps Lise would like to comment.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I think it's important to kind of mention within anthropology, we are all social beings. No, human beings are not it's not designed for us to live on our own. We're not independent beings. We're always socially connected. And so if you think about it that way, I think about like the whole world of money and economy and one separate thing, and we're living in that system, in that world system, but there's pockets of culture within it, and we're all kind of surviving in that pockets of culture. So if you look at your neighbors, or if you look at where you come from and your family, like even your friends, that small dynamic that you have is still a social structure, and we are dependent on each other. We're just kind of living amongst these rules that we have to, and that's kind of out of our control.
Thanks. So this is an interesting one. It occupies the boundary between what we're talking about, Lise, and to some extent, one of the economists, we'll see, the sharing economy. And that's about women shed, men shed kind of stuff, where they've got all these tools that people can come in and use for their members, blah, blah, blah. Car sharing, tool sharing, sharing projectors, whatever. That's a really important phenomenon that's starting to gain traction.
Yes.
But there's versions of this from your example, Lise, and there's also the commercial versions of this. And so it's an interesting mix. And so what's your take on that, and how important is it?
I mean, in a way, you can see the business operates in theory, according to a lot of rules and regulations and institutions. And in a way, this is modern industrial society's attempt to cope with the reduction in the principle of reciprocity. It's tried to codify things into rules, but of course the rules are broken, and it's the most powerful groups that dominate the markets, and that's why we need political economy that Dennis is studying, vital part, because it's about power structures. And I would argue we also need the insights from social ecological economics because of their emphasis on the environment and social justice and prosperity. So you could think we're in a deprived society, that we have lost a lot of the things that Lisa's talking about, and that our indigenous people had in their societies. They had structure, that's pretty clear. And they had reciprocity and obligations and guilt and so on. But we've lost a lot, and what we've gained is a set of rules that the most powerful don't follow.
The discipline has this, there's an importance of highlighting emotion. That's a concrete theory as well within anthropology. It's so important to kind of zoom in to that, oh, I feel guilty, or I feel a sense of happiness. Those are things that are important in ways that our society and structures work. So let's say about car shares. If I was doing an anthropological ethnography in it, then I might interview people, how do you feel like you're sharing it? They might say, oh, someone who borrowed it before me left their drink in the car. That makes me feel like I'm sharing something with them. That's still a part of that person's self within that car. And so I think as human beings, we're able to notice these things, even if they're small objects, and connect it to how we feel. And that kind of sense of feeling is, it kind of binds us together. It's just that with car sharings and sharing things online and virtual realities these days, it's so much more outside of our body. It's not a bodily experience, as in with Sasaki, you actually see it, you feel it, you do something to it. I pickled my vegetables, I knew where it came from. It's an embodied experience. We are a little bit more further away from that in the virtual world or car sharing and things like that. But we are able to interpret and feel of what is left behind in that car or anywhere else. So we are kind of social beings, and we are interconnected in that way. And there's something that I think is so important and quite precious that we can highlight on our abilities to feel and to feel connected to one another in that kind of way, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Well, thank you for all the presenters. Mine's not so much a question, but more a comment to Lisa. Just to give you some confidence here, we're speaking to the right audience here in economics. I'll just give you two examples.
Okay.
I study modern monetary theory, and in that scene we look at where money has come from, its history and its purpose, and it turns out it's not what the economists have told us. It is transactional commodity.
Definitely.
It's a social tool, a provisioning tool for public purpose.
Yeah.
And that comes from anthropological
It's beautiful,
studies,
yeah.
so that's very key. And
So beautiful.
of course, the go-to person there is the late David Graeber. He's been dead for the last 5,000 years. And secondly, from looking at the sort of degrowth scene, the most prominent, arguably most prominent degrowth scholar is Jason Hickel, who's also. So, I think you have some confidence that economics is sort of catching up to this idea that, heterodox, non-mainstream economics is catching up to the idea that we need to include people and our social conditioning into our economic thinking.
Definitely, that's beautiful. Thank you so much. Beautiful.
Great. Now I think we can move on to the next panel then. Thank you so much. I'm glad you guys enjoyed this.